All right, so now first let me just say that ever since I wrote the book, and of course before, I've been very much influenced by language. Both theoretical linguistics and applied linguistics and linguistic anthropology, and especially a new area, well, it's been around now for at least 40 years that I know of, called cognitive linguistics. Now, you might say, what does it have to do with sociology? Well, I want to argue that you can't have culture without cognition, and you can't have cognition without culture. But I think sociologists, if they ignored the term cognition, it sounds like some psychological thing that you were warned not to ignore and to avoid. Now, I'll read this. Let me read this one statement here, and then I'll get much more informal. Research on brain or cognitive affective processes, culture, social interaction, and structural analysis are overlapping, but often viewed as independent ways humans have attempted to understand the origins of their evolution, historical and contemporary development. Each level seeks to employ its own theoretical concepts and methods for depicting human nature and categorizing objects and events in the world, and often relies on different sources of evidence to support theoretical claims. Each level makes reference to different temporal bandwidths, that is milliseconds, seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, years, decades, centuries, and focuses on different spatiotemporal activities and controlled and non-controlled stimulus conditions. Biological mechanisms and environmental pressures for survival simultaneously created a gradual intersection and enhancement of cognitive affective skills, cultural practices, and changes in collaborative social interaction and communicative skills. The evolution of a given level of analysis is assumed to have been incremental and overlapping. These innovative and independent ways humans have learned to characterize their brain or cognitive affective and social, economic, political life often depend on unexamined, quote, representational redescriptions, unquote, or cognitive affective sociocultural devices and forms of communication that facilitate the depiction of practices and beliefs we attribute to respondents or subjects and research colleagues. This notion of representation redescription is, to me, very important. It's something that was created by someone called Annette Karmeloff-Smith, a developmental psychologist, and she's maybe still doing research in London. And I think her work is really basic for what I do, because she recognizes the importance of memory. Sociologists don't talk about memory very often. They may talk about something that Halbwachs, a student of Durkheim, talked about, but that's, and I have talked about Halbwachs in a different paper, but memory is crucial because you couldn't interview someone if you didn't have memory and they didn't have memory. That is, we couldn't exist without memory, and the two kinds of memory that I am presupposing here are called episodic and procedural memory. The episodic refers to when you interview somebody or you go to see a physician, they ask you, well, what brings you here? Well, I have this problem and this ache. And so that particular kind of memory is conscious. Procedural memory is unconscious, and it's the bulk of your memory. It's not Freudian repressed memory, although that could be part of it. It's a memory that gets activated as soon as you start talking about something. If someone says to you, how are you doing? Well, I'm not sure, I have a headache, and that may activate something immediately. And it's not that it's involuntary activation. Now that memory is crucial because the two kinds of memory have different neurobiological basis. They're not in the same places in the brain. Now that's very important because the episodic memory is basically in something called the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. But the other is in other areas. Now, so that means that your brain is working in a very complex way. But enough about the brain now, because I'm sure you're not interested in the brain. But I want to then say something that language for me is, again, essential We take language for granted. Now, I've studied for the last almost 40 years, I've been studying medical diagnostic reasoning. When I went to the University of California, San Diego, I was fortunate to get a position with some others, people who did real science, and I became a member of the Department of Pediatrics. I'm not a physician, remember, but I would teach the residents and fellows about how you could talk to a child and interview the child, because this is a big conundrum for them. And the medical school doesn't train them this way. All right, so you have this 3-year-old, and what do you say? And so I taught him something about language acquisition, like between 10 months and 44 months, the normal children learn language. All right. Now the memory increases, of course, but this is very important for a pediatrician because it's the most fearful part of their job, trying to understand the child. And the key issue also is that you can't depend on the mother. You can depend on a lot of things, but on this, the mother is always somewhat biased, okay? And so you have to try and get whatever the child can tell you. Now, if the child's 10 months old, you're gonna have a hard time doing the language part. But the point is that you really need to worry about language, and we tend to take it for granted. I think all social scientists tend to take language for granted, except maybe applied linguists, theoretical linguists. They don't care about everyday language, okay, or natural language, whatever you want to call it. But let me say something about language a minute, and then I'm going to go on to the research part. This comes from a longtime friend and colleague and one of the founders of cognitive linguistics, Gilles Fauconnier, his name is. He said, in our everyday common sense conception of language, we see words as having meaning and combinations of words as having composite meanings which can be applied to specific real or imagined situations. Cognitive linguistics offers a starkly different picture. Language structures are not in themselves the bearers of meaning, but rather prompts for its construction and guides for finding mappings appropriate for the situation at hand. The mapping schemes prompted by grammar are compositional. That's very like dictionary-like, okay? But the truth conditional content is not, since it is not predictable from the forms in isolation. If this were not already a formidable challenge for the brain and for the linguist, it turns out that a good deal of meaning construction takes place without any overt prompts at all. When a physician interviews a patient, and they'll often get closer and they look in their ears, or they're noticing at the same time with the skin. They're noticing the way the patient breathes. They're looking at the facial expressions the patient makes when they touch something or when they ask a particular question that may seem delicate to them. These invisible kinds of signals are basic to the way we interact, and all of you know that. When you interact with a friend, you immediately notice all this. You just don't look at the dress or the suit or the shirt. All right? These subtleties are the key to the way we understand each other. But sociologists don't study that sort of thing, and neither do psychologists. But some linguists are doing it, and linguistic anthropologists did some of it, and this goes back to Franz Boas's work and his student Edward Sapir. But here that the elaborate mental space configurations are set up and processed in the absence of explicit grammatical markings. That makes theoretical linguists a little annoyed. So these grammatical markings for the frames, spaces, and constructions needed. Almost finished. Okay. In this talk, then, I will try to illustrate some of this, but the point is, though, that language, without understanding language, and we tend to intuit what the other person's language. We ask questions in a questionnaire, but we don't independently ask the person or the subject, could you tell me, what do you think I'm asking? Well, how would you tell that to some friend? What would you say? And the same is true of when you give a response. The person getting the response, we don't ask that person, maybe the researcher or the physician, what do you make of that? And they don't, and physicians take very few notes. Right? So the point is that the bulk of the inferences that are involved in diagnosing a patient are these subtle, often invisible elements. Now, medicine prides itself, ever since that I can remember, it goes back to at least 1960, in the term evidence-based medicine. Now that not only means what the digital output of an MRI or some autopsy, okay, or biopsy, but it means also transforming a question you ask the patient and the response in particular into a digital output. That's what digital-based medicine really is about, okay? Now, for those the physicians are trying to be, quote, more scientific, unquote. Now, the problem is, I insist, and I have lots of discussions with physicians about this, they could not get evidence-based medicine off the ground if they didn't have this subtlety beforehand. And the patient, and now they often have terms for patients that give them problems. And these are usually metaphorical terms. So metaphors are crucial. In everyday life, we use metaphors constantly, right? Now, and without them, we'd be in trouble because you'd have to explain everything and you'd never finish your sentence, right? So, but metaphors and metonyms, which is more complicated, metonyms are interesting, and I often, the cognitive linguists love the metonyms. And so, for example, one that I heard one day, I was working up in a laboratory and observing the physicians in a virology and bacteriology lab. One said, "Oh, I see the Pseudomonas walked home yesterday from 9B." So the patient in 9B who had Pseudomonas, a serious bacterial infection, was discharged. Now, all of that is in that nice phrase, oh, the patient in 9B, or the one server says to the other in a restaurant, "The ham sandwich walked out without pain." That's another favorite. Okay, so metonyms are complicated, but the brain enables you to do this, and it makes speaking easier. Right? But if you had to unpack all of that, right, you'd never finish the conversation. Okay, so let me now just, there's more, but I think I better just go directly to some of this research, which I carefully wrote down today. So, okay, so my dissertation was on how the aged perceived their, how they perceived a change in their concept of self. That's who they are, okay? And I did that for a year in Ithaca, New York, when I was a graduate student at Cornell University. And I joined the Senior Citizens Club, and I would go to have lunch there every day, and I got to know people, and I would often pick some of them up at their home to give them a ride, and sometimes they would invite me to their homes for dinner, and that was really a lot of fun, because I would sit there and they'd say, you know, that goddamn son of mine, he's taking all my money. Right? And they say, you know, that's the trouble with these young people. Then once one would say, "Aaron, we don't mean you." Right? But they go on, okay? Now, I found that kind of interaction very interesting for lots of reasons, but I had a difficult time with that research because I found it depressing. Because all these people were helping me do my dissertation. And one I remember very vividly named Mimi. Mimi had 7 cats. I would take her to lunch because she couldn't move that easily. And one day he said to me, "Aaron, you know, I think I'm going to go soon. I want you to finish your interview because I know your dear wife is pregnant, and I want to make sure you finish your dissertation." Well, she did die a few weeks later. Right? Now that's why I never published a dissertation. I kept thinking of all these nice people I knew. Right? And I just couldn't deal with it. Okay. But then I went on and I did something totally different. I started a study in 1960 on juvenile justice in 2 cities in Southern California. One I called totally corrupt, and the other I called normal corrupt. Right? I don't know any city that doesn't have normal corruption in the United States. Anyway, so in those 2 cities, I had to study the 2 counties, and that was the probation departments in each. Now, it turned out I went to the police departments and the total corrupt, they just said, well, professor, I'm afraid we can't help you. We don't like this kind of research. Goodbye. And I went to the other one, and they said, well, you know, we'd like to help you, but it's kind of difficult. And then one day I met someone from my high school in Los Angeles, where I grew up. A man named Williams, really nice guy. And he was in my sister's class at the same high school. Well, we became good friends immediately, because that high school was kind of unusual. And he said, Aaron, I know how to help you. He said he was one of the top probation officers in this one county, in the good, minimal corruption. He said, I'm going to talk to my boss. And a week later he called me. Aaron, we have a solution. We're going to make you a probation officer without pay. Great. I go back to the police department. They said, well, now that you're a probation officer, we have to let you come in and look at our records and talk to us or whatever you want. And so I went to the other city, and they helped me do that. And I was able to get in. This is a way of telling you now how difficult it can be to do the research. So then I would be able to go around with the police, and my dear wife was taking care of 3 very young children, right? One almost a newborn. Okay, now, fortunately that enabled me to be out Saturday nights or Sunday night or whatever, up until 2 in the morning or something with the police. Now that's how I learned about juvenile justice. And I would go to the courts and everything. I learned a lot this way, but I did that research for 4 years. I knew people quite well, okay. But when I finished the book, it took, I didn't finish till 1968, right, the Social Organization of Juvenile Justice. I remember vividly that I sent a copy of the book to the office, the police department with not major corruption. And they had a luncheon, and we talked about the book, and they said, I said, well, what do you think? Well, Aaron, you think you did a good job? You understood what we did, and we're really pleased that no one could identify us in the book as you promised. And I said, look, come on, guys, there must be something else. And they looked around at each other. There were about 6 of them. And one said, well, Aaron, we really did like the book, but if we had known we would not be identified, we would have told you a hell of a lot more. Now, that's really important, because this is the kind of information that is difficult to get from people doing research with people. And I've always done this, and I did the next study, and then I have a few more minutes, I think. The next study I did was in between. I had done 3 years, and then in 1963, my wife and I and our children, there was a 14-month-old baby, we got on a boat in New Orleans, a freighter, a one-class freighter, and we went all the way to Buenos Aires, Argentina, okay, and stopped along the way. And in Argentina, I replicated, I think that's the right word here, a study of fertility done in Jamaica by 2 especially well-known demographers. The dissertation is really by someone named Judith Blake Davis, and the other author was Kingsley Davis, very world-famous demographer, and someone named Stikos. Stikos was at Columbia, and the other 2 were at Berkeley. And I had spent time with Kingsley Davis in his demography lab. Now, that study required getting in a random sample. Well, fortunately, Gino Germani was a big demographer in Argentina, and the first chairman of the first sociology department in Argentina's history. Okay, and Davis and he had got an aerial probability sample of all of Buenos Aires and Gran Buenos Aires suburbs, most of which was low income, and so I was able to use their sample device to choose, and I did 100 interviews, not me. I had several people helping me, especially several women were excellent helping me. Without them, I would never have been able to finish. And I, of course, did interviews. Now, in Argentina, and if you go to the rural areas, like not rural but suburbs, they're like rural areas, because many times there's just no telephone, and people would sometimes for a half a mile, they would take a cord and they would put it in someone else's house, unbeknownst to the phone, and they would then suddenly have a telephone or electricity. Now, when you went, you always, well, and clap. And then someone opens a little window a little bit and says, you know, what do you want, you know? And you say, well, I'm from the University of Buenos Aires. Communists. And I found that didn't work very well. But fortunately, I was doing some work at the Children's Hospital. And one of the physicians who became our pediatrician for our children, and had done some work in Philadelphia, he said, tell them you're coming to Children's Hospital. They all come here, and it's free for them, and they know. I did that, and they said, oh, Children's Hospital. Oh, okay, what is it about? And that's how we were able to do the research on that. Now, that study, again, I did something else that my colleagues and the demographers didn't like at all. I paid my interviewers more money to tell me what was wrong with the questionnaire, which then I paid for each interview. Now, I paid for this later in a review of the book. The demographers thought I was not a good demographer. Okay, now, so those are the first two studies, and I think I'll just tell you what the next one was. And I did a classroom study in Santa Barbara, California, one with a community around the university, one in the center of Santa Barbara, the other one's called Goleta. And I was able to get in, not easily, just two schools, and where they had some middle income and a lot of low income in one, and more upper income in one, and again, minorities, the Latinos from Latin America, and African American students. And we got into the classroom and were able to put a videotape, one of the earliest video camera, in both classrooms. And it was going, they thought, all the time. It wasn't. We were able to go in and not make sure it wasn't on all the time. But then we would be doing that, and we transcribed all of the teachers' lessons, and we would show the teachers and ask the teacher to help us understand it. That was the third big study, and that also, each one had a book published. Yeah, my concern with measurement has never stopped, and what I would say is this, that in the book I said something to the effect that one of the problems that sociologists have, and other social scientists, is can you find a metric that corresponds to the phenomena you're studying? I don't think people really ask that question very often. But that's the key to measurement. It's one thing to get statistical techniques to use, but if they don't match, if there's no mapping, then it's not clear. You're just forcing a metric. And normally we talk about this as whether you get to reach let's say an interval scale, that is, you can subtract and add, but you don't have an absolute zero. Or do you have a ratio scale, right? Most of you know all about this. But the point is that it's very difficult to get a ratio scale in sociology. How would you define zero for some of these things, okay? Now, I spent some 4 or 5 years studying different kinds of mathematics, first as a graduate student and then as a young faculty member, to see if I could find a metric that corresponded to what I was doing. Now, so what I felt I should do then is do research that tried to identify the phenomena as systematically as I could and see if I could come across something that would resemble a metric that would make sense for the phenomena under study. Right? And frankly, I never found one, except, and I don't have time to go into it, there's something called, that you all know, analogical reasoning. Now, it turns out one of my former colleagues, a very good friend who acquires a bad case of Alzheimer's, David Rummelhart. And David had some marvelous materials on analogical reasoning, which is exactly what I was looking for, because I'm interested in how people reason in everyday life. And he was the first, and he is a very sophisticated mathematician. His first degrees are in math. He said, this is a conundrum for psychology because this kind of reasoning is everywhere, but we don't know We don't have a metric for it. And so in a paper I have, it's published, and then another one that has it, I go over this kind of reasoning. And the reason is, what I focus on then is moment-to-moment speech acts, speech events. And I do that with physicians and patients. So I'm interested in how does the physician reason, and I think I can show in my tape record and give you a word-by-word analysis, I don't have time here obviously, of what the physician says and what the patient says in response. I think I can show how the reasoning often is mistaken. They ignore what the patient says, does not respond, or the patient doesn't respond. But most patients, when they come to a clinic, they already have something that's sufficiently obvious that any trained physician would be able to detect. Now, general practitioners have this kind of a window, and things go by they don't see. They often don't see dementia, and I have actual cases where I could show that. The specialist has a narrow dementia. Very little goes by that they don't know something about. Right? And that's the difference between a specialist. But then here in Britain, the United States is the same, but not as fierce as I've had it happen to me in England. And you can't see a specialist easily. You go to the surgery, and they say, oh, what's wrong? They try and find out, and they say, well, you have to practically tell them you're dying. And they say, oh. Right? And I once did see an ophthalmologist, and they finally sent me to the University Hospital in London. And I remember I had to tell this person in surgery, well, I think I have something, I knew what to say to make something sound like it was bad. He said, well, okay. He was very reluctant. Okay. Now, this is the problem with universal health care in most societies. In the United States, it's almost impossible as well. And the United States, it's all run on a monetary basis. Okay, so anyway, I think that's the way I could answer your question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'm delighted that Aaron has talked about what you might call his real research, because it's one of the ironies about writing methodological texts that, if you're lucky, they sell in the thousands, even the 10,000s, and the monograph that you write about your real research sells in the, tens. So it's important to remember that Aaron's contribution has not been purely method and measurement, enormously significant though it was. And I just want to say a couple of things about that. One is that before there was an NCRM, there was an ESRC Research Methods Initiative. And before there was that initiative, Bob Burgess, Uncle Bob, did a lot of background work on the teaching of research methods in the United Kingdom. And as part of that, he collected and collated all of the reading lists and syllabuses from all of the departments of sociology that he could. And the one thing I want to say about that is that Method and Measurement was the most listed, recommended, and required book of all methods books at that time. It is a classic in that sense. I think, therefore, it also suffers the fate of most classics. That is, people don't read it. I don't mean that insultingly. I mean, it just seems to be the case that if it's a classic, people think they know what's in it. And very often what they think is in it is actually a very vulgarized, simplified, tertiary source version of what is actually in the book. Now, you might think that picking on a 50th anniversary to revisit a book is a kind of cheap trick. Yeah, well, it's a trick. Actually, the 1960s were so fecund that round about now there are all sorts of 50th anniversaries that you might want to investigate, reread, and so on. Studies in ethnomethodology comes up very soon. I'll just let that lie. Because actually, what very often was the case, and I suspect still is the case, is that people sort of remember method and measurement as being some sort of critique of quantitative social science, or a critique of the survey, or indeed a critique of the structured interview, and therefore a celebration of qualitative methods, field methods, and so on. And nothing could be further from the case. Aaron's work, which I'm not going to recapitulate, was a very fundamental critique of the nature of sociological and other social science reasoning. And insofar as it was a critique of the fact, as he represented it, that social scientists very often lack an adequate descriptive language, which is, as he's just said, faithful to the phenomena, that adequately represents the everyday reality, but represents, as it were, the substrate of the kind of phenomena that social scientists claim to investigate. And very briefly, one of the things that Robin and I were also motivated by was not merely recuperating that, but also pointing out that the self-same issues recur, the self-same issues apply now in different guises, but we still face the issues as social scientists of engaging in radical self-criticism of the kinds of descriptions that we use, the kinds of categories that we employ, the kinds of facts and phenomena that we ourselves create through our research activities. So I think that we are convinced that these issues remain pressing, remain relevant, and in some ways, indeed, are even more pressing and even more relevant than they were 50 years ago. So we remain in your debt, Aaron, and we're very grateful. And thank you.
Yeah, so Paul's covered a good deal of, I guess, the motivation for revisiting method of measurement and for writing the paper. I guess just to add a couple of things on there, I guess why I was particularly taken with the book. I guess like many students in the UK, I was taught it early on, read it a bit, let's be honest, at undergraduate level, and then kind of worked my way back to it, I guess, through the type of sociology that I was engaged in and through some of my own concerns and questions about the methods that we employ. Not necessarily in terms of how we might make those methods better as technicians, perhaps. C. Wright Mills was, of course, very critical about the idea that we might be just technicians rather than craftspersons, but that's perhaps for another day. And to think about instead is what are we really up to as social scientists practically when we head out to observe, when we head out to interview, when we engage people in that kind of interaction. And a lot of this, of course, is prefigured by Aaron's method of measurement. And particularly, the thing that always sticks with me, the tagline, if you want, is that the method and particularly measurement is a practical activity, an irredeemably practical activity. And in that sense, it gets done by people in real places. It involves making decisions. It involves, making calls on what counts and what doesn't count, what could be cleaned up, what are outliers, what are not, what should be ignored, what should be highlighted. And I think that is something that's really worth hanging on to, both in terms of how we think about our own methodological practice, but also in terms of subsequent studies, as Paul said, how we don't have to just be critical in an abstract sense. We can engage in studies of sociological practice. What's recently been called methodography is a particularly good way to get at this. That's a term borrowed from colleagues at Manchester, Wes Sharrock, Michael Mayer, and Christian Griefenhagen. So in my own kind of humble way, I've looked at people's coding practices. When a qualitative team sit down and look at an interview transcript, how is it that they kind of make science, if you want, out of their observations? How do they objectivate what it is they're seeing, to use one of Ken Lieberman's terms? And I think in looking forward, I'm not going to say too much on this because I know this is Emma's kind of angle on things. I've already spoken for you, sorry. No. But in terms of how we might think about the lessons for contemporary practices of measurement, it's easy to say that perhaps what I've just said doesn't count in some ways if you're thinking about big data or algorithms or some kinds of automated analyses. But I think, again, the important thing to retain from method measurement, particularly in that field, is that algorithms have the contours of society kind of woven into them. They have exclusions and inclusions and priorities designed in. I've forgotten who I've stolen this quote from, but you know, algorithms have racism baked into them, for example. And it's up to us, well, it's not up to us, you don't have to do this, but one of our roles as social scientists, I feel, is critically engaging with some of these emergent measurement practices, both in terms of theory, but also in terms of situated ethnographic study.
Back in 1983, Edward Leamer, who was a leading econometrician, wrote, "There are two things you are better off not watching in the making: sausages and econometric estimates." To which, in my writing, I have often added content analysis. This quantitative methodological approach to text, first developed by Harold D. Laswell in the 1940s. You will have heard a lot about content analysis by the time the festival is over, and I feel ambivalent about giving you this message of content analysis as a sausage you don't want to see in the making, perhaps sinking the very ship I have been sailing for about 30 years. In fact, my work on content analysis, which will then connect me to Aaron, started in 1981 as a postdoc at the University of Michigan at the Center for Research on Social Organization, directed by Charles Tilly. And it is there that I started toying with an idea of looking at linguistic properties of a text rather than at the theoretical substantive interest of an investigator, which is what content analysis does. I was very lucky. I was looking at the only type of text which has invariant linguistic properties, which is narrative. Narrative is about who, what, when, where, why, plus how. So it is that structure that I started using in my work on content analysis, a structure and a methodology that I would eventually call quantitative narrative analysis. And it is on this terrain of this alchemic transformation of words into numbers that I came across Cicourel's work on methods of measurement. And in particular, in my book, From Words to Numbers, Narrative, Data, and Social Science, I found myself in deep sympathy with Cicourel's critical stance on measurement when it came to content analysis, which is one of the techniques that he's very critical about in the book. At this point, the story of my journey from words to numbers became very personal, and that is why I prefer to read it. Hopefully, I will not get too emotional. Angela, she was up there earlier on, a British neuroscientist I sat next to at breakfast this morning, reassured me that if I broke down crying, it would be perfectly okay. You are Italian, that's what everybody, she's there, that's what everybody would expect of you. 10 years, actually 11 years in the UK, between Oxford and Reading, have not been able to make me into a tougher man. Anyway, beyond hope. Back to From Words to Numbers. When the book came out in 2004, I sent a copy to friends, including my mentor and friend, Chuck Tilly. Tilly wrote to me saying, "Roberto, did you send a copy to Aaron Cicourel? He always asked me about your work." To which I replied, "I don't know Cicourel, but I cite him heavily in the book, so I'll be happy to send him a copy." On June 3rd, 2004, this obsession of keeping everything, I sent the following email to Cicourel. "Dear Professor Cicourel, I have been meaning to write to you for a long time, then life got in the way. Anyway, a book I have been working on for several years, From Words to Numbers, Narrative, Data, and Social Science, is finally out with Cambridge. I am putting a copy in the mail for you. You will find yourself heavily cited there. I must say that I found your book on method and measurement truly brilliant. From Words to Numbers is certainly not brilliant, but I have tried very hard to write a different book. Anyway, I have held many unspoken conversations with you over recent years. You will soon see why when you get the book. Best regards, Roberto." Cicourel replied, thanking me and adding, "I remember reviewing 1 or 2 papers a few years ago that I am pleased to say I recommended that they be published." Upon reading the email, my heart started pounding. Why? In the acknowledgements of From Words to Numbers I write, in 1986, I submitted my first manuscript on the methodological approach I had developed to sociological methodology. The detailed comments I received from one of the reviewers fundamentally changed my approach away from artificial intelligence and closer to linguistics. Clifford Clogg, editor of the journal, strongly encouraged me to address the reviewer's recommendation. It took me 2 years to read this stuff that I knew nothing about. As a foremost linguist in the country, as Clifford Clogg put it, recommends. To that anonymous foremost linguist goes my deepest gratitude. Perhaps she or he may never know how deeply his review changed the course of my intellectual and professional trajectory. Could Cicourel be the reviewer of sociological methodology? Could he be the one that so fundamentally changed my life to the point that I have a book coming out on tropes and figures and rhetoric? So it took me a month, actually, to pick up the courage to ask the question that had been burning inside me for a month. Dear Aaron, at this point, after many email exchanges, there is one thing that I have been meaning to ask you after you mentioned to me that you reviewed one of my papers. I hope you do not mind me doing so. In the preface of From Words to Numbers, I tell a story about an anonymous reviewer, sorry, Angela, on how influential his or her review would turn out to be on my intellectual trajectory. Do please take a look at that and see if it is you. That would be an amazing coincidence. To which Cicourel replied, Dear Roberto, well, it is a small word. I was the referee that Clifford Clogg was talking about. The very strong emotion that email provoked in me, as you can see, are still there today, even 10 years later. And I am grateful for this opportunity to acknowledge publicly my debt and gratitude to Aaron for this tightly written, single-spaced handful of pages. I think it was 6 pages, handfully written. And from then on, every time I write a review, even when the author didn't put as much time as I have to do in order to write the review, I think about Aaron and think how he changed my life, and I think maybe this author who didn't put enough time in this paper deserves my review. Anyway, so yes, thank you, Aaron. And as I now start to push the frontier of content analysis, exploring automatic approaches to content analysis and to text, in this world of big data, I keep Cicourel's critique well before me. And if content analysis went at text with a hatchet, big data goes at it with a caterpillar, to say the least. Yesterday, Jane Elliott made perfectly clear how rapidly changing this world of big data is. NLP, natural language processing algorithm, which were cutting edge only 3 years ago, are now obsolete today. Some of my colleagues at Emory or at Georgia Tech are rewriting algorithms that were cutting edge 3 years ago because they no longer are, right? Back in 1989, at tenure time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, some colleagues were asking, what's Franzosi going to do with thousands of words in the computer? A question that would cost me dearly. I ended up not getting tenure, spending 2 years unemployed, and afterwards I'm meandering across universities and continents. Fair question, though. What's Franzosi going to do? The web was yet to come, and data were numbers, not words. What can you do with words? But again, as Jane made perfectly clear yesterday, words are now the cutting edge of data, the cutting edge of ESRC efforts to deal with them. So, as I see mostly young faces in the audience, do allow me to give you 3 pieces of advice. 1, when you get some brilliant, that you think it's a brilliant idea about a problem that you think you can crack in no time, pinch yourself a few times to make sure you are in touch with the reality. I have never been. 2, if you do give up in times of trouble, during my years of unemployment, etc., no one will ever hear about that brilliant idea of yours. 3, but keep in mind that even if you don't give up, there is no guarantee that anybody will care about your brilliant idea. In the end, I stand by what I wrote to Cicourel on June 25, 2004, in reply to his praises for my book. Your own book is truly an amazing piece of work. What you say on content analysis without being a specialist, I suppose, I didn't know his other work, requires such deep level of insider knowledge that I have always been struck by your insight. You may laugh at this point, but recently in Trento, I was telling a colleague there that as a non-quantitative, non-specialist in content analysis, you had achieved such depth of understanding on the process of quantification that I concluded by saying to him, the guy is a genius. That would be Aaron Cicourel.
Well, first of all, I came across method measurement when I was learning quantitative methods, and it was on the reading list, and I read it, and I was like, oh, okay. But then I had to teach it the following year, and then I read it better. And I only found out through reading your version of the book that it was seen as a critique of measurement, a critique of radical statistics, because actually I'd never seen it like that. And I had always used it to teach after that for postgraduates and undergraduates, and it was one of the most kind of important things I would press to students. And it was particularly a key quote that is in the first chapter of mathematics and sociology that I keep going back to, because for me, whether it's numbers or words, it's this sort of little moment that for me is just like, oh dear, this is what we're in. And you talk about, he makes a distinction between literal measurement and measurement by fiat. Don't know how you say that, but that's how it's. Literal measurement refers to an act of correspondence between the substantive elements and relations under study, and the ordered elements and the relations of the measurement system. The measurement system is quite important here. It's not just measurements, it's measurement system. Measurement by fiat, or fiat, I'm not sure, as an arbitrary or forced correspondence between the elements of the elements, relations and operations. And this, for me, became the real hook about measurement and what we do. We either force the measurement, or we try and get a one-to-one correspondence. But as he makes quite clear in that chapter, we can't do either. And we were better at forcing. And it's not because we're bad measurers, it's just because the social world is so hard to measure. And even if you try and put words to these measurements, you've got a problem. So for me, it was that hook of, oh, like what if we assume this thing is 1, and we use the measurement system that says this is 1? Might be happy about that. Might be, okay, fine, I'm happy with that one-to-one correspondence. But then I've got 2 or 4. Are they the same ones, or are they different ones? And this became really important to me in terms of how we think about the social world changing and how we think of measurements over time. And one of the things rereading this for me became really important. It's in the book, it became, for me, measurement was about trying to do this thing where you've got this object of the social world and you want a metric or a number or an index or a numeral to this object. But I think things now are changing because it's more like this and the measurements are in the system itself. And that's a different kind of measurement world that we live in. And that, for me, has made measurement even more important. So I've never seen it as a critique of measurement. I've always seen it as a way of thinking about measurement well and how to engage with the process of number systems as well as measurement systems. And of course, what happens once you measure about how things become classified and the mathematics that go into actually making different kinds of measurements. So I became very interested in things like proximity. How do you measure if something is similar or different? How do you do that when in words it might seem simple, but when it becomes a conceptual or a measurement system, it's very, very hard. So I never found it, nobody told me it was a critique of measurement, and nobody told me it was a critique of radical statistics. Nobody told me that if I was doing this, I was teaching a positive version, because actually what I took from it was a more nuanced approach to measuring the social world in general.
Well, I'm not sure how to respond.
You don't have to.
Well, yeah, I don't think I can really do justice to everybody's thinking on this, and I would only underscore the fact that it's making your own research problematic, theoretically and methodologically. It seems to me that makes any sense to me. And if you don't do that, then I think you're going to be taken in by your own act. That's one phrase I used to tell Irving Goffman that I liked of his work, which pleased him. But I said, that's about all, Irving. But he didn't like that. But that's a very important statement, that being taken in by your own act. And I think that's the problem. We sort of, the first year of graduate school is one of brainwashing. We tell them this is the only thing that really counts, and take everything and throw it out of your head. And this is what if you're going to be a real sociologist. And it's always a problem. I can remember the first time I got into trouble, which is, of course, just the first time, at Cornell, and they had all the graduate students, and we're sitting around this big room, and each faculty member was describing their research. And most of them had said, now I have 10 boxes of data, and you should all take advantage of this, and you can get a dissertation quickly. And each one had something similar. So finally, I raised my hand. I was getting kind of impatient. And I said, now, why would they want to use your data? I said, we don't know how you got it. We don't know what you did. We don't know what you're thinking. We don't know what any theory behind it. And then I noticed that most of the faculty was looking very angry. And as my mentor, Robin Williams, told me later, he said, Aaron, you just alienated 3/4 of the faculty. And I said, well, I'm counting on you as my chair to protect me.